Greetings, YouTube. I was listening to a news piece the other day on NPR. It was about the use of ecstasy in the treatment of PTSD. And they apparently are in their second round of trials, clinical trials, and they're having a great deal of success with it, which isn't totally shocking, as the right dose of ecstasy, you can create this incredibly strong emotional bond between two people, a sense of trust and comfort between the person taking it and the person that people they are with. Which can help break down barriers that exist between the client and the therapist. Barriers that may have been put up by horrendous amounts of abuse. And the woman in the news piece, in fact, had been tortured by her father for 9 years. And she had been in therapy for 15 years and had not been able to make the breakthrough she needed to get beyond the pain. And in fact, until taking the ecstasy, her father had been dead, I believe, for almost 20 years. And it wasn't until she began that round of drug tests that she finally believed in the core of her being that he was finally dead. And I can completely understand that state of mind, that the inability to connect to something or to an idea or to a person, because there is that barrier between you and your emotional states and you and a healthy view of the world because of post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not comparing my life experiences to this woman, but we've both been diagnosed with the same condition, and we both come out of a history of abuse. And while I have never taken ecstasy, and I will probably never take ecstasy, I don't really think I have any need to, the idea that this drug can help make that bond on a believable and real level when you have been raised in a manner that prevents you from having that kind of a connection, that this drug can overpower that incredible degree of training and conditioning and behavioral response. Because the thing is that when you're that young and something bad happens to you, your parents are gods. When your parents act in manners that don't make any sense, because they don't, because her father is obviously either clinically insane or just one of the greatest and most cruel human beings that there ever has been, or in the case of my father, who was a raving alcoholic, they don't make sense. There is no rhyme and reason, but you look for one. You desperately need to find one. And when you've gone through every conceivable option in your head, the one that makes the most sense to you is that your parents are fine and you're broken. And you believe this. You believe this so deep. And she said a great line, which was that it was like living with the mute button on. And the ecstasy helped turn the volume back on for her. And I completely grokked that statement, living with the mute button on. Of things being deadened around you and not being able to understand things in context because you don't perceive them the way everybody else does. I didn't know how relationships worked. I didn't know how healthy dynamics functioned between people that weren't raving alcoholics or suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't get it. I saw people doing things and connecting in ways, and I had to figure out through context, because I couldn't hear them, of what they were doing and how they were doing it and why they were doing it. How were they achieving their goals? It made no sense to me for a long time. And in my case, it was the din of anxiety that kept that mute button on. There was just no way for me to tamp it down to the point where I could then hear the world around me and make those connections with the people that I knew. It wasn't that I didn't want to make them. It wasn't that I didn't try again and again, and over time, through trial and error, I did figure out how to connect with people. But I did it like being dropped into a foreign country and having to figure out the language on my own with no one's help. Because the time in my life where I learned that language, I wasn't taught that language. I wasn't taught the language of how to make connections and relationships with people. Just that my father did. And my mother retreated to her into her own emotional and psychological defenses when my father was present. So even though I had a connection when he wasn't there, when he was there, I was on my own. Because she had to save herself. Because she was living in that nightmare as well. So I didn't take a drug to help get over this. It was a lot of research on my own. It was studying philosophy. It was studying Taoism and Buddhism, and eventually becoming a pagan. And it was reading a whole lot on the emotional states of being, and on trauma, and books that I didn't understand were going to teach me something, like the book Deep Survival, which taught me that there are processes in your brain you have no control over, that are how much you want to control over them. You just don't. And that book was the first book that ever taught me that. So I can't thank that author enough. Gonzalez, I think it was. I'm not positive. That book taught me that there are things that go on in your life that you have no control over. And you can accept that. And you can understand it, and you can use it, and work with it or around it. But it's still true. And that was the first step towards my eventually finding a therapist that functioned. Buying this house was one of the other steps, because it broke me emotionally in a way nothing else ever has. I know that probably makes no sense to people, but the emotional stress of buying this place snapped me, folks. It really did. And that eventually led me to seeing someone, a cognitive behavior therapist, the right one. Again, it took me 4 tries before I found the one that worked. And to take that mute button off. And to be able to understand how people make connections. And understand that the anxiety and the depression don't have to rule my life. Interestingly, the depression has been easier for me to tackle than the anxiety. Which isn't, I guess it isn't, there was a precedent in my life in that by the time I got to therapy, my relationship with my father had almost been worked out, but my relationship with my mother and many other people in my life hadn't. And I'd always thought that those relationships were okay, and my main issue was with my father, but I had actually solved most of those those issues where had been almost completely worked out by the time I got to therapy. It's like, some things come in the back door and you don't know what you least expect. I'm not sure if there was a real point to this video, other than that, if you suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety and depression, and you are living with the mute button on, you're not alone. And it can be fixed. And hopefully someday we're going to be able to prescribe ecstasy for people, so that they can help make those connections with their therapists and get past that barrier and let them understand how to make those connections and be able to take that mute button off and finally get it, to finally grok it, which probably really dates me by using that term. I'm sure there are younger people watching this that have no idea what the word grok means. G-R-O-K. Go look it up. But it is possible. Oh! Apparently it's time for squeaking, so it's time for me to go. But you can get better. And life is a whole lot more enjoyable when you can actually perceive everything the way it's supposed to be perceived.